Dia a todas.
Good morning, everyone. We would like to apologize once again for being late, but due to technical issues, we couldn't stream it. And of course, we would like to stream this very important professor, Professor Ricardo Abramovay. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation to be part of our seminar. Professor Abramovay is a professor of the Institute of Energy and Environment at the University of São Paulo, and he's going to talk about data ethics for artificial intelligence to the service of society. This is the top of his presentation. So, Professor Abramovay, you have the floor.
Bom dia a todos. Muito obrigado, Tanara. Muito obrigado aos organizadores.
Well, thank you very much for the organizers, especially CGI, Bruno, and this amazing team that you have created of members. I am really privileged and glad to be here this morning. I would like to start by making an observation. Data ethics has become one of the most important topics of contemporary geopolitics. Virgilio Almeida published an article today in the newspaper Valor and showed it beautifully. The problem, a very serious problem, that Brazil currently faces due to the absence of artificial intelligence strategy. As data ethics has become a global geopolitical issue, as was made very clear to all of us yesterday, it is organically connected to the role that artificial intelligence has in our daily life. Talk about privacy and personal data management is no longer something that relates to our individuality, but rather a strategic topic in terms of technology and what we expect of our economic system. The power of statistical methods, the mass of data, easy data treatment, and the creation of environments where we create data from our homes to our cities, going through agriculture, industry, economy. It all strengthens this constant link between data and artificial intelligence. Therefore, it involves our relation with artificial intelligence, which is part of our daily life, and speak about artificial intelligence also means talk about personal data. And this is the main reason why protection and privacy to personal data, which is the topic of this seminar, and I have been very lucky to participate today for the first time after 9 years. And this is something that goes beyond our individuality, and it has gained a collective social dimension, as we heard yesterday by Fernanda Bruno, making us face unique challenges concerning all our life. It's not the right of simply be on our own as Warren Review wrote almost 100 years, we have two fundamental values of contemporary society. First of all, and it's quite interesting to observe that, free competition. It is a value. We don't want, as citizens, and someone active in our fields or the government, as a society, we don't want a society in which there is not free competition. And when I have young entrepreneurs, I am sure that these young entrepreneurs do not consider entrepreneurship as the opposite of social emancipation and the fight against unfair distribution of income. And why do I say that? Because the way we treat and deal with data, it is an obstacle to free competition. Hal Varian, one of the most important microeconomists, and if you have studied microeconomics, probably you've studied that, he states that the barriers to creation of new businesses were reduced in digital's world because we have to invest in building, construction, facility, machine. But to have a technology startup, we don't need anything. We just do it at home. Many studies show that this is mystification because the main basis to have anything significant in technology is data. And data are concentrated. Despite my graying hair, I'm still a newcomer in this area, and I'm really amazed at the literature and to what extent we hear the monopoly, because there are just so few that we can call it a monopoly of data in the hands of few economic players with very negative impacts on economic activity. Ariel Ishaki and Mauricio Stuck talk about data poly, and this is a very important notion. The book they wrote is called Virtual Competition. The power of those that hold data. It has grown so much that it has become a threat to market economy. David Arthur, Robert Gordon, the economist that worked with President Obama, Jason Furman, they all follow the same line. We do have a serious problem in terms of data concentration, and this is something that inhibits entrepreneurship, not only in the US, but all over the world. So data monopoly have become a barrier to entrepreneurship. I was the other day speaking in CBN, the radio network, and someone said, maybe the law of personal data, won't it prevent innovation? Quite to the contrary. The current situation is preventing innovation. The literature is very clear along these lines. Entrepreneurship is there. We cannot say that digital giants are preventing entrepreneurship. Quite to the contrary. This has been impacted by the power that few companies have on data. Congressman Orlando Silva emphasized the legal importance of having a law on data protection. It should be a strategic objective. Economist Georgia Bashi has very important studies along these lines, and I think Congressman is absolutely right in his comments. But it's more than that. It's not only data export. What is at stake is our capacity so that our entrepreneurship goes from selling coconut out in the beach to become decentralized digital entrepreneurship of a broad scale. And we cannot do that without a law of personal data protection. If we want entrepreneurship and deconcentration of entrepreneurial initiatives, we need legislation and an agency that coordinates this transition. Another second important issue that I would like to make allusion to is democracy, our capacity to live together in a constructive fashion. The literature on human rights emphasizes three key areas: individual freedom, our right to property, to asset, and social rights. Three generations of rights, and I have here a audience of lawyers, and I'm being very simplistic in my description. In the past 10 years, what we have witnessed is a new generation of human rights, and this is something extremely important for our understanding about values and ethics. Portability is an example of this new generation of rights. And before everything that we've discussed here, it wouldn't exist. As Bruno Gincarelli said, people should have control over data. And this is why this seminar is taking place at the same time that we talk about protection of children and adolescents. Automatic decisions is also part of this new generation of rights. And this is why we have to analyze the impact on our social life, considering how data are collected, managed, treated, and delivered back to society. The need to consider the impacts and environmental impact is something clear. Similarly, if there is an important production which may impact vital resources to the society, water, air, soil, biodiversity, ground. When I'm dealing with data, the same applies. Francisco Brito talked about that yesterday when he was saying data is the new gas, the new richness of resources. And this new generation of human rights that we've seen in recent years is what Luciano Farides calls group privacy. This is something fascinating. I don't know, because I'm a newcomer in the area, I'm still fascinated by it, or if you still share the same kind of fascination. Privacy has become a public issue, something really important that goes beyond individual rights. So Luciano Floridi, in his book published in 2016, it's called Group Privacy. It's like a contradiction, isn't it? Because the capacity that algorithms and data management systems have to detect group behaviors, this capacity has grown so much that even if people are not being impacted, social groups can be impacted, regardless of the individual nature of its members. We can anticipate, for example, migration. In Brazil, we are dealing with that, with people from Venezuela. And this idea of closing the borders, fortunately, was suppressed, but we have been observing that with the Venezuelan immigrants. But in Europe, for example, or in African countries, you can anticipate migration processes, and as such, you can have a human constructive approach or something based on prejudice, repression, and the worst feelings that these situations may trigger in people. So these are new challenges and new rights that are surging. The right not to be invaded or surveyed, as Germanier said, not be treated as a dump. And this is what the author used himself. So it has become a fundamental aspiration of human organizations in the days we are living. Privacy has a social value that goes beyond individual rights. I was quite impressed when I saw a description by Tristan Harris of captology. It is a subject which comprises the techniques used to capture human attention. It can be used constructively, but that's not the experience that he had in the places where he worked. Another important category in this generation of new human rights brought by digital revolution is the idea that we are data subject. We cannot be treated as objects, data objects. We are subjects. IDAC campaign, your data are you. It's not you equals a set of data. It's the other way around. What the algorithm is going to address has to be subject to an increasingly important value. In the ethical advisory group of the European authority that is going to implement GDPR, so Jaron Lanier, Luciano Floridi, and some others, human dignity, for example. 20 years ago, if we said human dignity as a fundamental value of societies, nobody would understand. Now everyone knows what it means when we say, in our relationship with virtual world, we really have to make sure that human dignity is an essential value. For example, facial recognition techniques. In China, some schools are now using cameras to detect whether children are paying attention. This is something against human dignity, in my opinion, for the teachers and for the students. The reactions that it may because I really can barely describe that. The idea of some Chinese cities, when you cross the streets, facial recognition. For example, if you cross the road with red traffic light, a picture is taken of you, and there is a panel where they have your name, your picture, and the penalty you have to pay. This is not compatible with human dignity, in my opinion. We have to be very careful about the idea of smart cities. Privacy International has some documents which are really interesting. Of course, we want cities to be highly connected, as recommended by the Habitat, but we want smart citizens. Smart cities, so far, have been a synonym of a society of surveillance, and we have to be very careful and pay close attention for it not to happen. And this is one of the main reasons why Danilo Doneda said yesterday, half of the countries that are part of the United Nations have laws that protect personal data, and only 20 of the countries have no regulating agencies. We have to be ready to have a setting where we have a combination of different associations representing the society, the corporate, and the government to address this topic. And many organizations then would be related with research centers. For example, Media Lab in MIT. There are studies towards developing artificial intelligence, but at the same time, they are focusing on ethical issues and some social organizations. It is an ecosystem of personal data protection, and this is really important. Boyana Belami yesterday talked about embed the topic of privacy in organizations. And some of the initiatives described by Telefonica and Google are part of that, very positive initiatives towards that. Therefore, there are two key values here. Our entrepreneurship capability, entrepreneurship being decentralized, dealing with this wealth of data, and democracy. What is the basic assumption? And this is something that we have to make very clear. Maybe it's clear to you, but not to lay people. The idea that artificial intelligence is a challenge. It's something that is going to put an end to our lives. Harari has a very wonderful book, and I think there is one problem there. It addresses technology as if it were a fatality, something we cannot deal with. And I disagree. As DME Gecko said yesterday, and I liked him, not everything is wrong necessarily. Data have shown that this is a social situation in which many things are going fine. Raquel Gatto said that as well yesterday. We should not have a negative attitude towards the internet. Internet is the most important public asset created by human intelligence. Maybe cities are that, but cities simply emerged, whereas internet has been invented. And it is a public asset. Data ethics has to recognize the importance and the potential of data science. this tension between data ethics and data science is something that has really amazed me. Maybe because I've been working for a little time, but this is something extremely intriguing from a cultural political perspective, trying to understand the tension between data ethics and data science. Data science concentrates the most advanced frontier of contemporary intelligence. So, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and algorithms that impact our life and can only work based on the data we provide. The impact, positive impact on health, mobility, safety, education, knowledge about life, biodiversity, fighting against deforesting. I've been working over 30 years about social development and sustainable development, so the quality of this discussion wouldn't be the same unless we had all the advances of digital improvement. Paris Agreement from 15 wouldn't have helped had it been from the breakthroughs of the digital era so that China and India can really transition into a different world.
But including social life, that has been quite revolutionary. Alex Expanded has the book called Social Physics, and the key argument of the book is social sciences so far, they either followed small groups. With that, they could design an image about the daily lives of these groups, what ethnologists do really well together to traditional communities and cities. And you can know about that because that's a small group, because researchers, they cannot follow them forever. Or they work with the census, trying to make hypotheses about human behavior by comparing different researches. Digital era when smartphone emerged as well as a set of several other tools had changed our daily lives. Today we may follow lively human masses behavior, which is quite revolutionary in social sciences. However, that revolution has not yet been encompassed by social sciences, but still that's a way to learn more about those societies, to propose new policies based on this knowledge platform that is revolutionary. It is, and it will transform those sciences that know more about society. Data ethics became a key tool for two main reasons. First, to rescue ambitions of those who were pioneers in the digital development. What am I talking about? A recent report from Cédric Villani, who is a mathematician. You had probably seen a picture of him. He's a guy that dates from the 18th century, always wearing a colorful tie, and he's got a Fields Award, and he was appointed a congressman, and Macron's president submitted him a report about artificial intelligence. What is the core message of that report?
Os dados circulam.
We want data to circulate. We do not want to have closed data. Data ethics is not to hold all this fortune The National Report of Freedom and Technology follows the same direction, as well as the British one. We want your answer. We want to have an open internet. We want that, and it's possible to have at the same time a protected and open internet. This is the practical concern. First goal of our society, and that has to be with science of data. We want data to circulate. Virgilio's Almeida article published today at Valor Economic newspaper is extremely interesting.
Nosso país não tem uma estratégia de inteligência.
He shows that our country has no strategy of artificial intelligence. I remember perfectly the fourth issue. What's that? Ethics of data, which supposes a data protection law. If we want to have any chance at all to participate to what is being done in terms of technological information, we have to have a law of data protection and an agency which will favor institutional environment of freedom and protection. That and those who emphasize just one of the sizes to open or protection, that is inconsequent. We need both. And the base of that reasoning, it made data, turn data into a community well-being commons. That is fascinating, the Villani report, where personal data are treated as commons. Commons does not mean that it does not belong to anyone. On the contrary, these are personal data. But the human, the mankind exposes a set of information supplied by subjects to benefit mankind. And I would like to close my talk with a question. What does ethics mean? Ethics to Greeks is the discipline which studies the reason for mankind. Why are we doing what we are doing? That search for orientation. This search of orientation is not simply something individual. But to society, these questions are essential. Why are we doing that for? Why do we produce cars? To improve our mobility. But to improve mobility, producing cars that are blocking our mobility, ethics is key here. Why are we producing food? To feed people, but to feed people based on ultra-processed food, as that became a global epidemic. Why do we need data? Why do we need artificial intelligence? Those of you that work directly in that field, anything regarding reasons, purpose, They have to be placed. Economic science cannot do that properly. That is a science which concentrates over instruments, tools. We do need a reflection which goes beyond that, a reflection which tells us about goals, reasons, data, artificial intelligence. What for? The Swiss Hard published a very interesting book
dizendo o fundamental
where he summarizes the essential is not what we can do today. It's important to know what we have to do. And in the digital era, with all this power and with all the apparatus, these questions become fundamental. That's why Cedric Villani names his report to give some sense to artificial intelligence. And what should we do? We have to discuss socially those proposals where data is collected, stored, and used. We don't need a surveillance society. We do need security information about transport, about health, about different markets. We don't need a surveillance society. Nevertheless, we want that will hinder our democracy and capacity of innovation. Of course, we want innovation, we want learning, and we have to motivate and expand local intelligence, Brazilian, Latin American, where we'll become key players that expects governmental investments. This is a country with over 200 million inhabitants. In addition to export soya, meat, and iron, by doing investments, we may favor intelligence and economy based on knowledge and intelligence. Third, data circulation, that is key, and how you manage that cannot be concentrated in the hands of federal police. That is a topic to be discussed and to be managed by organizations, multi-stakeholders, where CGI is a great example. Fourth, France will introduce digital ethics and artificial intelligence at schools. They have an idea about that topic. That's very important. The link between humanity and science is one of the challenges of the contemporary society. That there is someone who has been writing a lot about the need to bring together humanity, science, digital revolution, and everything else which we are living in terms of machinery learning. That's a great opportunity. And last but not least important, that has been highlighted yesterday, much more than a data protection law, we are facing a possibility to see the emergence of a collective learning system. Everything is so new. We cannot just say, well, somebody will solve that. We do need authorities, but they must have a spirit which manages CGI and any other organizations, where collective learning is key, learning by our own mistakes. which will allow artificial intelligence algorithm to the service of our well-being and not as a threat to our well-being. Thank you.
Muito interessante, professor, quando você coloca... Eu que sou da área de computação,
I come from computer science. When you say about and the tension between data science and data ethics, that raises a number of issues in data science. There is also a bias behind the collection process and what you can take based on collected data. But I have a question before I give you the floor about what has been said in the beginning of your talk about concentration, data concentration. That is not exclusive to Brazil. And I'd like to know if, in that sense, with all changes and the new legislations, are we in the proper way to decrease, to downsize the data concentration?
Eu usei a palavra tensão.
I used the word tension.
Eu fiz toda a minha carreira na faculdade de economia, fui chefe do departamento de
I
economia.
was chief of economy department,
Então eu
but I'm a sociologist.
eu não sou da tribo.
I'm not from this gang.
Embora sejam adotados de certa maneira. Os economistas
Economists, they usually think about a trade-off dilemma. In that sense, that's a very important reflection. We have a trade-off between protection
e avanço da ciência dos dados.
and advance of data.
Eu quero crer,
No, or science of data, I should say.
pode responder essa pergunta muito melhor. Eu quero crer ao contrário.
I want to create exactly the opposite. We have a certain stress between them, but we have to apply exactly the opposite, which is an integration between both,
Elemento que permita maior
to turn that into an element that will allow more legal security
atividade social do que fazem os que estão na ciência dos dados.
rather than what is in the science of data. Data ethics, it's one of the bases over which science of data will work at. When you present a project to FAPESP, there is always a form. If you are going to deal with animals, you have to fill that out. Well, but that goes beyond it. It's not just I'm doing anything bad. No, that will demand an ability to show that those things are useful and that in face of a risk, those risks, they will be managed in a reasonable way. Talking about data concentration today, it became something banal. An Economist cover would put Mark Zuckerberg as an emperor. Economist, Financial Times, Le Monde, all large world journals, newspapers, and I'm not talking about those that are left-wing, but rather those who are liberal, orthodox. They have been emphasizing data concentration, and that is quite fascinating. It's useless to say, well, capitalism, that's the problem. That doesn't make any sense or whatsoever. No one has the faintest idea what that means. I've never seen anyone statutize the digital giants. So solutions, emerging solutions, and the idea of emergency has that characteristics. Those emergent solutions, they are a result of the relationship between the different strengths of the society. I have the feeling that we are going towards the right direction, where that environment of legislations of personal data protection and the idea that we are subjects of our data that may favor more competition and more diversity and more attention, vigilance, more reflection about risks which we run in terms of discriminations, prejudice, and so on. Questions now?
Vamos fazer cinco perguntas. Acho que a gente faz bloco de 3. O pessoal fica para depois.
So let's start with 3 questions, okay?
Vamos lá?
Podem se identificar quando
Isso,
perguntarem?
fala o seu nome.
Bom dia, professor. Meu nome é Giovanni Peroni, sou advogado.
My name is Peroni. I am a lawyer. I have a question about the agencies of authority to be created. Yesterday, there was a very interesting discussion during the cocktail party. And Tiago Camargo, who is a representative of the health ministry, he said that he was against the law, especially the regulatory agencies. You mentioned that it's key to create an agency. And what's your take on that? That agency would be impossible in politics, law, and many others. And take into account the complexity. A multi-stakeholder organization. How do you see that reality of the regulatory agencies and all difficulties that we find in Brazil that has to be treated if that is not under penalty? How do you see that? We have imported that model, and right now, where we face some crisis in Brazil, that becomes even more clear. What's your take on that? Let's try to be brief in your questions. Thank you. I am also a lawyer. I have worked quite a lot with IT, and I have a question about the potential that artificial intelligence has. I compare that in terms of humanity evolution, as how you break the atom. You had an ethical dilemma where you use that for equipments for cancer cure, radiotherapy, energy generation. If the right will be enough or not. If maybe we should think about humanistic formation. Today, considering the world, the complexity, law or legal aspects won't be able to do it. So the solution would not be to create a humanity 2.0, and what elements would be important for that? I am from the National Forum for Democratization of the Society and Rights in the Network.
sobre ética de dados, e a minha reflexão vai no
My
sentido
reflection
desse debate sobre
goes
inteligência artificial
toward
e algoritmos, né?
algorithms and artificial
Podemos, por
intelligence,
exemplo, falar de
because we could go
algoritmos éticos,
beyond
ética de
that.
algoritmos, mas como falar sobre isso uma vez que nós temos uma
How can we
tensão
talk about that
entre
once there is a certain
a questão do
tension
segredo industrial e da
between
propriedade
industrial
intelectual sobre os
secret
algoritmos e uma exigência de haver algum controle
and a
público
demand
de
to have
alguns
any type of public
algoritmos
control,
na
public
própria
discussion
construção dos
as
algoritmos, na
how we
própria
construct
escolha de que
algorithms
algoritmos,
and how
como
we choose
fazer, como
algorithms,
discutir
how
essa
to do
tensão
it, how to
entre
discuss
segredo
about that
industrial e
stress
interesse
between
público
public interest and
nessa
industrial
questão dos
secrecy.
algoritmos de
As to
aprendizados
algorithms, there is a very
hoje
broad
sobre
debate
governança de
about
algoritmos, porque
algorithms
é
governance.
um tema que é bastante complexo e se a gente fala de sujeitos de dados,
And if we
eu
talk
acho que
about
ao incorporar essa visão, é dizer
and to
que os
incorporate
nossos
that
dados não
vision is
podemos
to
ser
say that we
mercadorias
cannot be
que
just
são
goods
tratadas como
which are treated.
ativo econômico, né? Então, como é que o senhor vê
How do you
isso?
see
Há uma
that?
possibilidade de haver
Is
um
there any
controle público
possibility
no
to have a
debate,
public control, a more
basicamente
transparent
no campo
debate
privado sobre as escolhas e os
in the
parâmetros
private
utilizados
field
para a
about
construção
choices
dos
and chosen
algoritmos?
parameters?
O mais importante
The most important
essa
of
discussão
all,
sobre agências
and this discussion
regulatórias
about
no Brasil,
regulatory agencies in
autoridade,
Brazil,
tanto como
about
agência,
the
o Brasil
authorities
está muito
in
prejudicado. O que
Brazil, that is quite
aconteceu com as
hindered,
agências
considering what happened
regulatórias,
to
né?
regulatory
A
agencies.
ideia é super
The idea
interessante,
is so
existem muitas agências,
interesting.
não sou especialista no
I'm
tema,
not an expert in that topic, but
como as agências
we can
foram
tell how
prejudicadas por
agencies were
manipulação
hindered
política.
by political manipulation,
Existem
etc.,
hipóteses para
etc.
demonstrar uma ideia que é uma ideia interessante, que é você ter uma inteligência voltada
You have to have an intelligence going
para
towards
determinadas áreas.
some
Nesse
areas.
caso, ainda é mais importante. O Vinícius ontem
Vinicius yesterday
falou uma coisa, o Bruno me chamou a
said
atenção hoje de manhã para isso, com toda a razão. A inteligência artificial
artificial
não é um
intelligence
setor.
is not a sector.
Tudo que está sendo, tudo que está emergindo agora, não é setorial.
Anything which is emerging is not
Todos,
sectorial.
absolutamente
It
todos os
affects
campos
all
das
fields,
nossas
all
vidas.
sectors of our lives.
É fascinante, etc. Ao mesmo tempo, é profundamente inquietante. Eu tenho netos,
I have grandchildren.
tá certo? Bom,
Well,
nem vou
let's
entrar
not
nesse,
get into that.
muito bem. Então, qual é a função
What
fundamental
is the key
dessa
role
autoridade?
of
É
that
criar um
authority
ambiente institucional em que o conjunto dos atores
where
vá
the
numa
set
certa
of
direção. Que
authors
direção?
goes
Essa
towards a
direção
certain
não é simplesmente
direction?
que vai ser escolhida pela sociedade como se fosse
Not
uma
one that will
eleição.
be chosen
Não,
by the
essa
society
direção é
like
o
an election,
resultado
but
de
the
estudos.
result of
O documento que eu citei
discussions.
da Comissão Nacional de
The
Informática e
document which
Propriedade
I
na
had
França
mentioned,
é muito interessante porque ele foi
in the
elaborado
one from
a partir
France,
de uma
is
modalidade
very
de
interesting
consulta
because
pública
that
na
was
Europa
based
que
on a
tem
modality of
uma
public
certa
hearing.
relevância. Quando você tem um tema polêmico, por exemplo,
When you have a
transgênicos,
polemic
você,
issue such as
você faz
transgenics,
reuniões locais
if you
com grupos
make
de
local
cidadãos e muitas vezes esses
meetings
cidadãos têm o
with a
poder
group
de
of
chamar
citizens who
especialistas.
have
E os
the
cidadãos
power to call
formam
for
eles elaboram
experts.
relatórios. É muito interessante porque as posições que
It's
saem
very
desses
interesting
relatórios
because the
desses
positions
documentos
that go over
são
that
muito
report,
equilibradas.
they are well
São muito
balanced.
equilibradas. Então, acho que uma agência
So I think that
ela
an
tem que
agency
fundamentalmente
should
criar
essentially
inteligência pela qual
create
nós vamos lidar com
intelligence
aquele tema
throughout which
no
will
mundo
deal with a
global.
topic
A
that,
nossa
if
própria
that's new
indústria,
in the world, to us, that is quite absent. We are not the main players. The main players are US, China, UK, Canada, and Israel. That's it. No one representing Latin America. How can we go on with that? We have to step into it, and a regulatory agency has that role. I agree with your point. Literature is developing that a lot. A French, who is Jean-Pierre Depreux, has been working hardly on that. Nick Boston has also published a great book, Superintelligence. His lab considers that there are three human risks.
Climate changes, atomic energy, and artificial intelligence. What really disturbs me in this kind of approach by Yvonne Nahari and Ostrom is that what we learn when we study sociology is that we live in a kind of a prison as society and as subject. So the walls of the prison are always cracked. And one of the secrets of being hopeful is to find the cracks of the walls and really go deep into that. The humanistic formation you mentioned is absolutely essential. And it's not only working with artificial intelligence. So Edward Wilson, both cultures and humanistic culture is one of the main challenges of contemporary society. Concerning the change of position of the private sector, this is the main challenge we have. The progress that we had in environmental issues has been really fantastic, but now there is more investment in coal. In Rio 92, companies were not there, but in Rio Plus 20, the companies were fully engrossed, but shortly the carbon investment will be over in 16 years because they haven't reduced the emissions. So these are problems that are going to be brought to artificial intelligence attention. And if someone has a silver bullet and say, I know what to do about it, it's a lie, nobody knows. And this is why we need CGI and we need data protection, we need authorities, and so on and so forth. We've got 3 more minutes. Percival, if you ask a quick question, I guess it's enough, and then, well, he has already mentioned something that I have already thought about. Our concern focused on artificial intelligence only, absolute sufficiency of people, and forgetting what would be natural intelligence and the strategy to maintain the perspective of the cracks on the wall, the humanistic portion of it. When Depreux beat Kasparov, everyone said, so no more chess playing. So I agree with the importance of having a centralized agency and doing things like that, but I'm really concerned about the fact that there is not a generalized strategic discussion differently from what we have in public safety. We just work on prevention, we buy more weapons, more ammunition, and we don't discuss the global issue. So how can we really use the so-called natural intelligence and using artificial intelligence to the common good. To close, and of course I don't intend to answer your questions because that's unthoughtful, but I would like to recommend reading a paper published by Joe Ito in Wired, Why Japanese people are not afraid of robots, whereas Western world is afraid of robots. It's a wonderful article. It shows that Buddhist and Shintoism relates with other species and other objects, which is not a relationship of supremacy, of hierarchy, where someone calls the shot and the other one respects or obeys. There is a relationship of respect among species and even respect with objects. Objects have to be respected likewise. This doesn't have a sign of singularity. In a previous article, he emphasized these ambitions of a singularity or a totalitarian position. One day the world will be entirely known. Quite to the opposite. In this article, he emphasized humbleness, which is essential to deal with something that gives us power and artificial intelligence. The main challenge is to have this feeling of human-centered elements of humbleness permeate the social life and even corporate activities. This is a major challenge, a challenge that has brought us all here today, and nobody can be absolutely sure that we are going to succeed. But I am positive that this is a battle that should be fought. Thank you, Professor Abramovich, for your wonderful presentation. Thank you for being here with us. Now we are going to break for coffee. Somewhat late, but our panel was 1 hour, so wonderful. We really stick to our time. Thank you very much.
Muito bom dia, senhoras e senhores. É com muita satisfação que damos início a mais um painel do nosso evento, que tem por objeto o seguinte tema: perfis comportamentais do consumidor, as possibilidades e os limites do tratamento de dados para fins de estratificação, segmentação e categorização. Integram este painel. Eu já passo a convidar para que integre a mesa as seguintes pessoas: Joyce Ariane Souza, Mário Viola de Azevedo Cunha, Ricardo Murichita Vada e Veridiana Alimonte. Farei uma breve leitura do currículo dos nossos painelistas. A Joyce Ariane Souza é doutoranda e mestre em Ciências Humanas e Sociais pela Universidade Federal do ABC.
Let me give the floor to the first speaker, a researcher of the lab, the same university, correlating communication and technology and privacy and collaborative practice in Internet. Mário Viola de Azevedo Cunha. We had a meeting in a seminar in Rio, and a data protection. He worked for the electricity company in Rio. He is a professor of law and a consumer right in the School of Insurance. He was a professor in the unit of Rio de Janeiro. He is a master in the master's degree in the University of Rio, Masters of Research in the European Institute, and he has his postgrad in private law. Veridiana has her master's in economic law, University of São Paulo. Was a lawyer of IDEC between 11 and 15. She also represented the third sector between 12 and 2013. And she participated in the department between July and September 2017, and she is a member of Intervozes, Brazilian Collective of Social Communication. Ricardo is on his way. Let me greet you, Ricardo. Wonderful to have you here. Let me briefly read your CV. He has his graduation in PUC São Paulo, his master's degree in University of São Paulo, and has his doc in here, PUC São Paulo. He was director of the National Department of Consumers Defense and a coordinator of consumers' right with Fundação Getúlio Vargas. And he's also with IDP. Each panelist will have up to 20 minutes for comments. Next, we are going to have about 25 minutes to open for a Q&A session. I would like to thank you all for being here this morning, and also our panel members. Let me start by asking Joyce to start her presentation. Good morning, everyone. I would like to start CGI and NIC.br to be here and greet them for organizing this seminar for 9 consecutive years so that we can discuss privacy to personal data, which is something so essential. I would like to greet my panel fellow members. It's wonderful to be here to hear about the presentation. Will be about my master's dissertation in the Federal University ABC, where I'm taking now my doctorate study, my PhD. I'm going to talk about the health of personal data, which is just a pun, because I refer to what happens to personal data in healthcare. In my presentation, I'm going to address this perspective and tell you how data are being collected, monitored, and analyzed. For empirical research, I selected public and private health of the city of São Caetano do Sul. It was selected because of some specificities it has, and at that time, they were factors that favored access to all the different sectors in the area. São Caetano is one of the 5,000 cities in Brazil. It has the best HDI in Brazil. It has about 15 kilometers, 160,000 inhabitants, the better HDA, according to per capita income, which grew 85% in the last decades to almost 250 per reals. I used a technique called snowball technique. It's a method. Why did I use that in this municipality that has one of the highest HDIs in Brazil? Considering patients' data, it is a market which is somewhat obscure, that it involves a lot of secrecy. And this is why it's difficult to penetrate with all the players. This technique uses a reference chain, kind of a network. So I selected some documents that helped me and taught me about the market so that I could really learn more about that. Considering what was possible to detect throughout the period during my study, which I completed in 2 years, there are 5 hospitals, 10 primary care units, 16 special units, and 4 centers for the elderly. Privately, there are 2 hospitals, 8 clinical labs, and 23 pharmacies. I could not detect private clinics, private offices in the city. Based on snowball method and considering this area, working in all these organizations, talking to different people, those that develop systems, those that provide data to systems, and also health representatives, I managed to detect which data are being collected. People normally provide personal data with identification, public records, demographic data, healthcare plans in details, and data about the health status of the people. I have also gathered the information and where they are being collected from. So analyzing all the different healthcare centers, all these organizations collect the information from the moment the patient gets in. And where are they being analyzed and stored? In a private and public situation, but primarily in private companies, companies that are specialized in developing technological hospital solutions, which are present in most of the organizations, and not only in Brazil, but also in Latin America. They are hired based on the knowledge they have, because most of them have been specialized for many years in this area. And another justification was the cost. As this system is engrossed in different areas, it does not have the same public area and cost. Therefore, personal data provide to all the different agencies a number of benefits, as we've heard in other panels. Personal data has been through some breakthrough. Here, it involves research, a number of operational facilities, reduction in costs, improvement in health care and private care. And I've brought some screen prints so that you can check some of the systems and solutions to which I have had access. There is the history of the municipality, and we can see all the members that are served through SUS, or Universal Healthcare System. They also have a card used for medication dispenser, and through barcoding, the hospital can detect who has prescribed the medication, who was the person responsible for administering that, who has received, what time, giving a much broader understanding of what's going on in medication dispensing. It also talks about the movement of and the transfer of inpatients. So if the patient goes to a different bed, a different unit. In addition to bringing benefits and advances for healthcare, they also has brought a number of issues that really concern selling of personal data, stratification, classification, and control by government and controls. We can see collection of data. Upon arriving at any health setting, they have to inform religion. And I wonder why. Why do they have to say what their religion is? How is that going to impact healthcare? What kind of impact does it have? And also on public health. Why do we have to state our religion? If there is a legislation that protects data, but without national authority, this is not going to be solved, because these are some overuse of data in medical care. Not to mention the pharmacies. So I have dedicated a whole chapter to pharmacy and drugstores. In all of those that I have interviews, they were anonymous, but all recorded and had been agreed on. Drogazil and Drogaria have 106 healthcare plans through which they offer discounts in medication. Droga São Paulo has 30 partnerships with healthcare plan, and recently it started a new modality of partnership, which is a partnership with companies, but we do not know exactly which are the companies. Where you can know whether your company is a partner or not, you have to type in your zip code. I got the following information. The percentage of reduction discount in products and medication ranges a lot. For generics, discounts may get as high as 75%. Among reference agents, the average reduction is 30%. in one of the explanations I obtained, so how are these data shared with the insurance market? There is one central unit who dedicates specifically to that and submits to companies and insurance companies a detailed report of each client that used a discount. So it includes customer. So they have to have the number of the medical care, which drugs were purchased, so not only medication but also other products, how it was done through the website of the stores, and payment terms. For partnering companies, they provide similar data, but also including the number and the registration of the person in the company. The market of drugstores is still not very clear. We don't know why there are such partnerships. Why are there discounts at such high proportions? Is it information-based capitalism based on supplies managed by personal data? What's happening in this area? Is there a choice? Can we not provide our social security or taxpayer number where our minimum wage is 900 reals, so 13 million people are unemployed? Is it an option to inform your taxpayer number and get up to 75% discount? How can we set limits to excessive use? How can we have a transparent process with the population so that they know how the data are being stored, categorized, and used? Let me tell you a little bit about the insurance market. In 2008, there was one article in the United States in which a journalist showed that thousands of records in drugstores were being sold to healthcare companies, and they wanted to reach competitive advantages so that they would know who were the people who were more likely to incur in medical expenses. 1% of the patients represent more than 1/5 of the costs on health. 5% represent almost half of the costs to healthcare insurance companies. Insurance companies that could select the healthy subjects can be much more profitable than those that accept everyone. Is it what's happening with our drugstores in Brazil? This is an issue that deserves further studies. Personal data, when talking about stratification, one of the words used in this panel is that health score already exists. According to Franklin Pasquale, the Black Box Society, a body score maybe one day be more important than the credit scoring of person. David Lyon, who studies surveillance in Canada, states that these systems are social classification means social ordering, not inspected and not regulated. They affect the likelihood of choices, and as such, they have to be recognized. In addition, their growth requires an ethic understanding, as we've heard in the previous panel, and I totally agree. So we need democratic involvement. So why aren't there multi-sectors discussing the national agency, the authority? Why don't we create a national agency with different stakeholders so that they can discuss that? Because in my opinion, it goes beyond law and it goes beyond technology. Contemporary surveillance is exercised by large organizations that have strong interest on personal data, especially the valuable ones. People, therefore, will have to face a disadvantage. So how will people be part of the system of stratification in which a predictive analysis might have future diseases? So how will they be accepted by the healthcare plans? How will they be treated in our universal healthcare system? These are issues which haven't been brought to the attention of society. So in seminars such as these, we can show you the importance of opening that for discussions. Thank you very much for your participation this morning.
Agradeço e parabenizo.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Joyce. Let me now hand it over to Professor Mario Viola. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank Bruno and Danilo for asking me to come here, and the Confederation of Insurance Companies who appointed me to be here today. I would like to greet NIC.br and CGI for being here today. This is the most important seminar on personal data privacy, and it's part of the international scenario. I would like to make two preliminary comments. First, it's really difficult to speak in a panel after Professor Abramovai. This idea of ethics and data, this is exactly what's going to guide our presentation. So segmentation, classification, everything related to ethics. And the main universities in the world, so Oxford, Stanford, are offering graduation courses on information technology, philosophy and ethics, and this is what we have to bear in mind and think about what we can do in terms of segmentation. I would like to make another preliminary observation. Even though I'm speaking on behalf of the Confederation of Insurance Companies, I'm speaking as a consultant, not representing the market. For some market issues, I wouldn't be the right person to address them. It was important to start the panel just by hearing about personal data and everything. We need to exercise the rights of access and control of information, because based on the bio that I was read, it stopped my performance 10 years ago. No PhD, no books, I haven't worked for UNICEF or as a professor. So we really should have better control on our information, and this is our own information. I'm not speaking as a representative of the private or public sector. I think that we can, I would like to speak as a technician, someone qualified in the area. I will address all the issues as I think they should be addressed. The problem is we've talked about PLC, but today there are a number of personal data privacy, and this is what I'm going to talk about.
3 minutos e pouco preliminares, mas então eu vou agora concentrar na fala.
I'm going now to concentrate on my main presentation. When Bruno asked me to be part of this panel, I was somewhat challenged to know how we can address profiles within what I believe is data protection and within insurance perspective. So I'm going to talk about generalization, stratification, segmentation, categorization, which are practices of insurance market, and I'll make reference to it because I was asked to talk about that. I'm going to talk about information asymmetry, which is one of the reasons for categorization. I'm going to talk about the current limits classification, segmentation, data control, European, and then our bill, our specific bill, and the difference between our bill submitted to the authorities and the GDPR in terms of automatic decision-making. And as Professor Abramova has pointed out, these are the limits related with ethics and moral issues. Ethics by definition, so we have that clear understanding. So privacy by design and ethics by design. So there are two models: regulatory model of data protection, which will control what's coming out of the black box and going into the black box, and what's in between, which we think is more of ethical values right from the moment we create the new technologies. So talking about categorization, I don't like to sit while I'm speaking, but I'll try to avoid some movement. I have an Italian background, and this is why I use my hands a lot. The most important topic in this panel is the idea of stratification. Stratification expects generalization. To stratify, to divide or break down people into different categories, you have to treat them from a generical perspective. So you define people. On the left, I'm going to consider one group. In the middle, everyone will be part of a group, and so on to the right. So it works for everything, and our brain works like that in an order of stratification and categorization. You identify, your brain can automatically identify preset standards. When you look and say, well, I like that person, or I did not like that person, this is related to prejudice, criteria, previously thought and experienced things. So everyday activities and economic activities really deal with categorization, segmentation, and there is nothing bad about that. This is not a problem per se. The problem is to know the limits for the classification, as we are going to discuss here today. Classification and segmentation for insurance and for economic sectors overall intends to limit risks. And why is it important? You have to be aware of the cost that some specific asset or value of, let's say, a health or a life. So you have an insurance against fire, for example. You have to know the statistic, the percentage of risk that one specific piece of furniture will get on fire, or the likelihood of someone die, or the likelihood of the person not being able to pay a loan, for example. So all these risks, all these profiles based on past information, on a track record, based on preset categorizations. And here we have an example of some issues such as age, gender, location, zip code, but it could also be whether the person has a previous history of health, any health condition, occupation. So thinking about creating profiles and setting risks, we have to think about limits as well. Professor Joyce has emphasized the private healthcare market and the need to set limits. I really think we have to determine limits, and the drugstores, as a citizen, I don't like it because I came on vacation to Brazil I went to two drugstores and they asked whether I had any card, healthcare insurance card, to offer a discount. I can understand there might be a legitimate purpose, but issues related to health For health care, here in Brazil, as identified, would not have any logic of exclusion. The law in Brazil makes it very clear that you cannot deny coverage because of health. You might have a grace period from 180 days to 1 year, but you cannot exclude anyone from your coverage. Also, use of genetic data, which has a discriminatory potential. In the Netherlands and England, they acknowledge the existence of genetic data for a specific disease. In England, they have Huntington's disease. If the person has a genetic background on Huntington's disease, they can use the data for some specific insurance and offer much higher premiums. So there are limitations. Even in the US, a country that is considered very liberal in terms of data use for healthcare, there is a law that prevents the use of generic data and genetic data. So there are moral values which are represented through norms and regulations, limiting the way that data are managed. For healthcare in Brazil, there are some limits in its use. Better knowledge about, in an attempt to better learn about the person, having access to data intends to reduce information asymmetry. So the bank or the health insurance company or the insurance company will not take over a risk without knowing who is the person being insured. But the asymmetry of information is a two-way route. So you receive information, request information, and at the same time you provide clear information. So the insurance companies have to provide clear information. For example, about the contract terms, the civil code states that creating this obligation of providing clear information about the insurance contract rules. This is all part of most contracts and insurance contracts which date back from a long time, where we have a link of trust. The Brazilian Civil Code has two dispositions where it states the importance of providing true, genuine information, and it sets penalties if the information is not accurate so that insurance can be actually provided. So there is a legal framework to support that. Professor Abramovich has talked about dignity of humans and how that has changed our understanding as the baseline of everything we do. So everything has had a more person-centered understanding. So now we rely on good faith, providing information, receiving information. It's not only a company providing no information back to the user. Now, going from the theory into the practice, I'm going to show you some of our models and what we have been doing and been trying to do with the adoption of the bill and the approval of the law. We have some automatic creation of profiles and a jurisprudence and previous case laws. There is a decision of the higher court of justice. I don't know if Zenata's here, one of the main advocates of this decision, which set the limitations of data treatment for credit analysis. So the higher court defined at that occasion that all limits of consumer protection and privacy among transactions had to be respected, and the higher court stated that the risk assessment should be based on two main elements. So no records and the consumer's rights. So we would consider it the fact that the person had no previous records, and also a consumer defense. So right to access, possibility of made rectification, broad access, and the higher court stated as well that consumers would have the possibility of requiring clarifications about which data would be used, and also personal information that were taken into consideration. So a perception of better control about information. The way it's going to be used is something that might change, because data protection law has some difference from regular law. It's based on civil responsibility and damage repair. 90% of issues concerning violation and data protection do not have direct material impact. So there is no clear incentive for appealing or filing a suit for indemnification. Most cases concern credit, because there you are subject to a restrictive impairment.
But the higher court says that for credit line analysis, they should not evaluate excessive information. As Professor Abramovay has mentioned before. So we have a specific scheme to those credit risk evaluation systems. Of course, that with consumers defense code that is also supported, which I will talk later on. In the legal framework, in the Internet legal framework, it says that information has to be clear in terms of use, treatment, storage, where the data holder or the user of an Internet app has the right to get clear information. Much is said about reasons when a certain data should have a specific means to be justified by its collection. Once again, that idea of need, use, for something which can be specified or not in the contracts of use of that information. So in our agency, we have set limits for how to treat general data. CVC says that data has to be objective, clear, real. Here with CGI, I'm not having any consumer relationship. That's why that would not apply here. I could not demand anything based on CDC. But there is a possibility to have access to information sources, negative information. They cannot be kept for a certain limit of time. I mean, a number of limits that are on the way. Of course, that law is much more detailed with a list of several different types of protections which may be applied not only to the private sector but also to the entrepreneur world, with several norms establishing some limits. I will share now the European experience and the regulations in Europe. They are very clear about different definitions in a way when they segment that forecast for analysis, anything related to economic situation, health. This is the original text in the Portuguese version, Portuguese from Portugal. Bear that in mind. The European Union usually uses Portuguese from Portugal. I mean, we have automated decisions to somehow have a control of logics and reasoning. We have some type of rights which holder can ask for. You may be against an automated treatment, but in case there is an informed consent as the legal base for the treatment, except for direct marketing. There is a point here to highlight, which is different from our PLC. GDPR emphasizes the non-application of automated decisions. I mean, our PLC is a bit broader than GDPR, as it points out that it does not apply, I mean, that possibility of revising automatic recommendations in case that is required for contract issues or if that is based on the holder informed consent. With that, we can expand the protection as to Brazilian rights if that is really accepted and approved. And that was extremely addressed last night during the cocktail party. Profile and behavior monitoring, that is one of the legal bases to export the European model. If you are outside Europe, you can monitor Europeans, even if that has no economic scope. And last, still talking about the PLC, it states the non-discrimination, where they establish what is supposed to be a classification or categorization process, which would be just those which are abusive or illegal. And we have to understand and interpret what is supposed to be somewhat illegal. But I suppose that is something that goes against the moral of a citizen, and to revise automated work with no limitations as it happens in the European model. Having said all of that, thank you so much for your attention and patience. I'll be around for the Q&A session right after this panel. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Viola. Now I'd like to hand to Veridiana Alimont, who was considered the holder of CGI 2011-2013. Good morning to all of you. Let me thank for the invitation and also to congratulate CGI for this long history of discussion about privacy and personal data protection. I will address this talk as an analyst of the Electronic Foundation. That is an American organization founded with the aim to advocate for freedom and civil rights in the Internet. And privacy is one of the main pillars. I will start with a more general presentation, and then I'll go into details about data collection and data treatment for online advertisement. Still along that lines, what is key to EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation, would be what is scanned by the online publicity. This is an agency which collects users and creates profiles based on different activities. There is a research from January 2016 conducted by two researchers from the University of Princeton, where they measured over 1 million websites and they verified third-party scanners.
Vamos lá. Não próprio site.
Not only the website, but third-party tracers, where there were tracers at the applications that would be useful to capture and collect users' information. And just few of them are present in most websites. At this chart, you can see the number of trace content, as well as just a few of them are present in most of researched websites. And part of those third parts, they are intermediate which do not even show you the ad, but they just collect information and they retarget that to those companies that effectively show the ad. That is the so-called retargeting. That's a technology which allows that an ad can follow you at different websites. It seems that that shoes or that piece of clothes is tracking you and running after you at different websites. Cookies. Here you can see a cookie with some eyes really watching you, so you can really get the feeling. Cookie is a small code which is downloaded at users' browsers, which stores information that can be useful. It may store your main language if you are buying something and then you have in your basket. When you go back, you can still have that good at the basket, but it also follows your navigation and sends that information to marketing companies which will monitor that code piece stored in the web. So if you search for a website with the same API, they will ask, have you got my cookie installed? If so, they will know that that user who generated that cookie in a previous site is the user which is accessing that same website. And with that, they can track all websites where that user searched for, as long as that cookie is verified beforehand. And there are some elements which you don't even know that may have a cookie. When you use a link shortener, before that shortener directs you to the website, they place a cookie there. Or even when you search for websites where there is a like button in social networks, that also involves cookies at the social media. And you might not be even aware of that. So throughout those techniques, companies, they monitor our activities, sometimes without our concern, going through several websites, building up detailed profiles about our behavior and interests. And that gets even worse when we are talking about third parts. Sometimes the website monitors something that you don't even know, such as how long you spent in a certain page or the movement of your cursor. With no transparency or users' control, such a practice, it seems and sounds very scary, much more scary than useful, to be honest. The problem, though, is not online publicity, but how that is done, especially if it's done in a hidden way. So in addition not to have transparency or users control being very scary and not useful at all, also there is a relationship to a link to a context where different decisions are made in each one of the contexts based on profiles which we do not know, constructed by artificial intelligence such as machine learning, deep learning. They reach conclusions about yourself which are totally different from information which you had shared, leading to discriminatory risks. Discrimination about offers or discrimination about paid content which you get, which can be publicity or any other contexts now, especially during this political phase that we'll be living with internet involvement. Some of those companies who have these tools and make use of them to direct online publicity, they also perform at different business lines, such as credit risk analysis. In the previous panel, Ricardo told us that that has to do with our right of not being manipulated to know what sort of information we have about ourselves, how are they treated, and what sort of conclusions are taken from this information, and what sort of practical consequences can that lead to. That's why we believe that ads and personalizations, that is not a problem by itself, but when they are done in a hidden form that can represent some type of danger. There is a online tracking with which EFF works quite a lot. That is not even so modern because EFF has a paper from 2010. But I would like to elaborate a little bit more about fingerprinting. That is an alternative to cookies. When you visit a site with short down link and you are not aware of that, in general they are visible. You may reject cookies. They can be erased, deleted. Digital fingerprinting in the navigator, those are invisible and much more difficult to block. Whenever you access a website, navigator, when it makes access to the website, makes a number of configurations which may lead to a unique combination. And websites can do that without being detected. And there is no relationship whatsoever to your cookies setup, if they are enabled or not. And even when you delete cookies, there is no relation, because what it's being analyzed are configurations to that website. That's a paper from 2010. You may visit and access this link. There was a specific fingerprinting algorithm and a sample of over 470,000 navigators, where in 83% of these cases, of this sample, I should say, there was a unique fingerprinting. Over 5% of those configurations noticed by the navigator, they were just similar to another one, to a second one. And whenever Adobe Flash or Java was enabled, the single fingerprinting percentage was even higher. The database of those who assessed the EFF, that is a database of people who are more concerned about privacy than regular users. And in addition to that, during the research, it's relevant to notice that almost 40% of the fingerprinting have changed, especially after you perform a report of navigator elements which make you more unique. But the assess algorithm, just one of them, was able to find and follow, to guess and follow alterations. In 99.1% of all cases, it was able to correlate the new fingerprinting generated by the navigator to the previous one. What is effectively collected? That's a mix of HTTP headers with information acquired by the navigator, such as time zone, sources, plugins, languages, differently from cookies. That is not stored at your machine, but at companies' servers. And they can be even used to recreate those erased cookies, creating a new cookie every time you access that website. But still, there is an information where they can identify, well, I know this person, that is exactly that previous cookie which had been erased before. That does not offer any useful functionality to users. And even in the fraud issues, You should observe a transparency. In practical terms, a global identifier is created throughout which we may follow users' navigation and create profiles in a hidden way, much more than cookies even. And as to the GDPR implementation, EFF published a month ago in partnership with the Panoptic Foundation a detailed post about the type of relationship of this practice with GDPR. GDPR does not treat specifically technologies. Electronic communication privacy guidelines try to be as neutral as possible. But still, there is a key element, which is the identification of personal data, where any information related to a person who can be identified directly or indirectly. There is no need to establish a specific identity of that person, but if that can be identified immediately and then make any sort of reference to that person as a single identity, that is still considered to be a personal data. And the goal of fingerprinting is to have such a capacity where we identify single agents and to raise behavioral profiles to finally direct ads and publicity to this group of people. And talking about being anonymous or not, the Article 29 Working Party says that if the proposal of the activity is the identification, regulators, they should understand that controller, they have a reasonable technical means to identify people, as that will just make sense if that allows identification of specific subjects. Said that, fingerprinting is under GDPR norms. So would that be allowed or not? Out of the 6 legal bases, we should highlight consent and legal interest of those who monitor it, where companies, they should review the use of fingerprinting and to have explicit informed consent, which is not the case. And according to EFF, that would barely happen, as visibility of the technique is part of the fingerprinting nature that works as an alternative to those more transparent techniques. Legitimacy should understand and what are users' rights. It seems that fundamental interests, they overcome that legitimacy. I guess that although we have here a group of experts, most of you do not know that once you access a website, you are sending information to a provider to identify you as a single user. If they pass that test, they should expose that legitimacy of users over that praxis. And as publicity is the main goal, users could just say no if they do not agree with the legitimacy of that interest. However, that's not how that is being done lately, not even in our assessment. That's why we consider that in face of GDPR, that sort of practice should be revised. E-Privacy Directive, which a consent would be necessary, and some tools that can help us, not just as to fingerprinting, but online tracking, Panoptic Click is a tool that drove the 2010 paper that is constantly updated, and it verifies how much your navigator has online tools protection. It verifies the single status of your navigator and how it compares to others. Well, your navigator is single as to several other navigators which were researched in the past 45 days, and then they go into details about characteristics, and you can have an idea how unique you are in relation to others. And anonymous results about this type of activity. Privacy Badger, that's not a publicity blocker or an ad blocker. The idea is not to get the publicity, but to be tracked after it with no control or whatsoever. So that is a privacy tool in general lines. That's an extension which prevents advertisers or third-party trackers to monitor you secretly. In your navigation, they check those websites that have trackers or traces with a high rate of recognition. And then this ad blocker blocks all those domains after that analysis goes through 3 strikes. Navigator fingerprinting, that's rather complex. It does not block all of them, just part of them. And if that is blocked, and if the domain is blocked by other tracers, that is blocked generally. And researchers or surveys, they do that to block as much as possible other identities. In fact, to avoid the fingerprinting, available mechanisms, they are much more complex than the one we have to get rid of cookies. That is a type of technique which seems to be widely invasive and obscure. Thank you.
Agradeço a doutora Viridiana Alimonte. Passo a palavra ao queridíssimo professor Ricardo Murichita Vada.
Let me invite Ricardo Murichita now, please, to speak.
Bom dia a todos. Caro Otávio, grande prazer estar aqui com você.
Thank you very much. Professor Otávio was someone very important for consumers' defense. He has really helped us a lot, so I'm really glad to be here with you, Otávio. I'm delighted to be here. Let me greet my fellow panelists. Viridiana, Mario Viola, and Joyce. I really enjoyed her presentation. I would like to thank CGI and NIC.br for the invitation. Bruno, thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you my reflections on consumers' rights. I can see friends from Foundation Procon. It's always important to have representatives of consumer defense here. I prepared a very simple presentation. Some thoughts about the possibilities and the limits concerning the use of personal data to define a consumer profile.
Obrigado. Então, para começar essa nossa reflexão, antes eu queria fazer algumas...
I would like to make some initial considerations.
Elas é que eu vou trazer uma perspectiva dessas discussões.
I'm going to give you the perspective where I'm going to share my experience with all of you. And I want to do that in consumer protection. Today in the morning I was late. I was coming from Brasilia, but I still attended part of Professor Abramovich's excellent talk. It's always a delight to hear you speaking. It's very intriguing and inspiring at the same time. When we talk about consumer protection, we may be taken by surprise. The topic of data protection is no big news. Maybe it's new in Brazil. Maybe it has brought to us new facts, new data that have to be learned by the society and by all the different agencies. However, when we want to bring this perspective of consumers' protection to the discussion, I have the impression that the microsystem of protecting consumers enacted in 1990, so celebrating 28 years of its first publication, the microsystem has brought a number of rules. It goes beyond Article 43 and Article 44. So this is how I'd like to share ideas with you. Secondly, and my second initial consideration, is that when we analyze data protection, it's not protection of data, but protection of people. This is the constitutional element that requires our analysis. From a constitutional perspective, I like to recall you that clause or Article 3 of the Constitution sets its own objectives. And paragraph 1 sets the objectives, the purpose of the Constitution of the Federated Republic of Brazil. One of the objectives is building a free, fair, and solidary society. If this is our statement of objectives, it has to be part of our whole understanding. And this is why this purpose is important, because data protection is all evolves around people, so there is a constitutional side to it. Another relevant issue to be made concerns recognition of privacy as a fundamental right. It's not only a negative action of the government, it's not non-violating. I think that the government has positive rights, so to speak. And Wilhelm Canaris states that a protection has to be enough to protect the citizen. And I think this is very much related with consent. It's a way of setting a contract. All contracts in constitutional interpretation have to have a social role. So constitutionally, we have large density, all centered on protecting people. Finally, the other initial consideration that I would like to make is that we are all in favor of technological development, everyone. And this is also part of the Consumer Defense Code. One of the principles emphasizes technological development, but it has to be compatible, it has to be present in dialogue with protecting people. And this is my assumption. Development is important. It's important to consider development, not only impacted by the moment we experience. I think we are a society with fear, and fear is something good. It takes us to other feelings, and writing public policies with fear, oh, that's one horrible. So we have to look with love, generosity, believe in development, that it's going to bring us good fruits, good effects to the entire society. I've heard the talks of two people this year. First, Professor Lily Fay. She's a professor from Stanford, one of the front runners of those that worked with artificial intelligence, and she said, the machine does not think on its own. We program the machine, our values, our considerations, and nothing reflects more a creator than the machine and artificial intelligence. But we have very few uncertainties. There is a wide range of possibilities and potentials. It makes us look with different tools. And this is why development brings within itself privacy, and it has to be, we have to move towards ethical regulations on how we can work with that. So there are three considerations that I would like to make for my considerations. So the purpose of data protection is protecting people, and it's no use trying to deal with what's going to happen. The best way to combine development is to make it be designed with that privacy and people protection, because after it's done, what can you do? It's worse to go after it later. So I think that this is the moment when we should focus on this information, dealing with these elements over 3 decades of data protection in the world and some experience in Brazil. This panel is bringing 2 main considerations. First, possibilities, and I think this is a very important element, and then limits. To talk about possibilities, I would like to say that I'd rather allow access to information, regardless of how it's going to be used. So we have to provide access. We have to provide the potential and use information. It's possible to do it. So we have to decide as a country what we are going to do about it. Answering this first question, is it possible? Of course it is. It is possible and it is necessary to use, to have this possibility of building more knowledge through the information. This is one first question which has a very important answer. It is possible, but we should always consider what are the effects. And I really liked the Checkmate guide. I really enjoyed that summary. So please accept my comment and command on your guide. So using data to provide behavior profile of consumers. First thing, we have to overcome the discussion of anonymous and personal data. Anonymous data, we are excluding things over which no protection will be provided. But this is like moving sand. And Veridiana showed that sometimes anonymous data can be used later and lead to identification. This differentiation doesn't help us. It creates distrust, a negative feeling. So creating a defensive position over which we really have to overcome. This is something that has to be considered. It is possible for anonymous data, as it's part of our current legislation, to have anonymous data also submitted to protection. To correlate that with consumers' defense, these are the considerations of Article 4 of our code. One of the elements setting as a description to understand and read the principles, the guidelines is the principle of people's dignity. I think it's the second most important principle of consumers' defense. And then paragraph 1, that identifies vulnerability of consumers. It does not start in the 90s, but rather in 1985 with the guidelines of the UN. So these are elements that emphasize possibility and a code and everything it encompasses. Another point which seems to be equally important is consent. You cannot deal with data unless you have consumers' consent. And I have a very strict position about that. The stronger the consent, the greater freedom you have. So rather than bringing uncertainty, it brings legal safety if it's precise and materially substantial. I think this is a very important path to take because of the confirmation and the creation of the country we want. All consent should be free, informed, clarifying, and with a purpose. Because if we agree, so much good. And in our society today, which has so many problems, it is essential that we have that certainty not only for the law, from the law, but from agreement of all our consumers. And I think that based on consent, I haven't identified in the text that talk about consent, Article 46 of the Defense Consumers, which thinks to be absolutely required, in my opinion. It is the first disposition of all contract relations, and it sets a very simple rule, which is really important, and it says a contract cannot produce an effect. It cannot produce effect, a legal effect, if it doesn't meet two basic requirements. First one, make sure that the consumer has had access of the terms of the contract, something informal. I cannot make a commitment with something I do not know. I only learn afterwards. I have to know in advance, and this is ethical and legal, to be informed previously. Second element is strategic. The code says understand, comprehend. It's deeper. You cannot agree to something that you do not understand, that you do not learn how it works. When we teach about this rule, I always make a joke with my students. Maybe we know our mother-in-law, but it does not mean we understand her. So different dimensions. The limit of interpretation is language. It can be expanded and used, but it does have a limit. So in this set of possibilities, we should analyze the existing rules, such as this one in Article 46 of the Consumers Defense Code. I think here we have a relevant correlation. The only exemption that we have that we can hire without a consent is because a previous consent has been given. Continuous service, you have already had a contract, so you can carry on. Outside that, there is no exception through which you can contract without having a consent. And this is why this is a very important point. And now the legislation that is going to be approved, I am really concerned. I hope the president can make a formal approval, thinking about the country, because we keep on listening to some possibilities of veto. I think that would be a disaster, not only to consumers, but to the entire society. Depending on how you veto, it may become ineffective. The law may become ineffective. And this is why I wanted to make a point, because if there is no exception in the code, the general law brings it, especially when you talk about big data, in which it's difficult to think about the consent. And this is why this mechanism of the legitimate interest is important, especially when you ensure transparency, ensuring access of consumers to information and control of the society. So is it possible to use data with the consent given by the consumer, but won't be precise because we're talking about big data? Yes, it is, but provided that you have possibility of access and control. My time is up, but I would like to make one more point. The consent in Brazil is very stiff, so to speak. To have a free email, for example, you have to give all your data, give out all your data. So take it or leave it. And I think it's too aggressive a relation, something that we should really rethink, because Article 39 of the Consumer's Code states that cross-selling is to require from consumer one thing to give the other. In this dimension, if you ask something so general in which we consent with everything, otherwise you don't have access, is something that goes beyond the exercise of rights or the idea of abuse, of overuse. But it does also ask when you violate that. But it only happens because one of the parties is weaker. You only abuse of those that you can abuse. It only happens because the other party has no element to get protection. And this is why this rule is so important, because it resets a minimally civilized way. And this is why granularity is something so important for the process. It is, Viridiana pointed out, Article 29, important guidelines that we should have, and I would like to go into the limits. My time is up. This code is very helpful. There is one part is abused because the other one is vulnerable, and we can think of maybe 10 abuses that we set as a limit for these activities. There are some cases that we could consider the geo-block when you use data to prevent contract, and I think this is abusive practice. If you offer products and services and the consumer is willing to pay, you cannot refuse. This is a general rule expected by the law. There is no, you should not speak about data use to prevent the case. It was a consumer trying to make a reservation of hotels during the World Cup, and they did not succeed. But if it were someone from Argentina, they could do it. So a Brazilian consumer does not spend a lot in a hotel. They just they don't use the services of the hotel. It's a low average ticket. Foreigners just use the hotel. They pay 12 reais for water. Why one spends more? So we prevent the one that spends less to using it. From a market perspective, we say, well, it's not ethical, but it's not acceptable. But there is a law, and the law forbids this kind of conduct. So I like to remind you that the limits are in the law. This is one example, and there are others. But let me remind you of the example that Joyce gave us in the case of drugstores. This is something that deserves an investigation of the society. There are agencies we could really focus that. What is this data being used for? Why do we need to know so much more? What is the correlation of this information and a discount? These are measures to control society. They are good for two things: understand the reason and the limits of rationality, and above all, really agree or not, because some things can be used, others not. So you should not define ex ante all rules, but rather bet on the process, on building it harmonically, setting all the new rules without necessarily having to have a legislative action. My time is all up. I apologize once again. But my final message is I'm highly favorable to using data. We are all favorable to that. Love and hope should guide our guidelines. We can be better as a society, as people, and as companies. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Ricardo, for your excellent presentation. I would like to tell you, because as we are running late, we'll be back after lunch at 2 o'clock. Let's now open to the audience. If you have a question to ask, please raise your hand and the microphone will be taken to you. Hi, I am Leite Monteiro. I am my doctorate, and I have two questions to Professor Mario and to Professor Ricardo. There is a constant discussion whether GDPR would expressly bring the right to an explanation. Professor Julia Pauls states that, and even a doctrine, whether this would be a right to transparency, and the underlying logics when you have automatic decisions. So I'd like to hear your opinion, whether there is a right to explanation in GDPR and in our Brazilian law, and if so, what are the limits of this explanation? Because if we are going to be based on the higher courts, they would say there is a right to access the data, but not to the logics. It's not, of course, a business secret. This is something really clear. So what would be the limits of this explanation to understand the logics behind that specially automated procedures? And Professor Ricardo, our general law, in its Article 2, says something that it's even more advanced than GDPR. Can be equally considered with personal data for the purpose of the law, those used to have a behavioral profile of some specific natural person. This is in anonymous data article. Our general thesis is that of those which are anonymous, which are not part of the norm, if used for behavior purposes of insurance or others, they'll be considered personal data if it's for one specific person. There was a change to the wording, so it had the word identifiable. And identifiable or identified is completely different. Can we consider it individualized? Because in a social network, I don't need to know who is the person. I individualize the person, and I can subject the person to one specific behavior based on anonymized data outside the rule. Because you talked about putting an end to dichotomy. Good morning. I'm Luisa. I am Internet and Society. And there we are constantly concerned about the use of personal data and collection in a network of drugstores. And we offered some consulting together with IDEC. And we are also looking for other organizations that would be interested to bring that to other cities where this practice is also followed. I would like to ask you, Joyce, concerning the contact you have had. Do you think it's possible to have greater transparency? How can we have more transparency in terms of data collection? And are they prepared to implement this new rule integrated with the consumer code rules? Good morning. I'm Rubia Ferrão. I am a lawyer and a professor with digital law. I would like to greet you and congratulate you and ask to Dr. Viridiana, whose study was on cookies. And I've seen a constant practice called cook stuffing or cook dropping. It's like poisoning the cookie of the user. So in this policy of not being invaded or not knowing exactly what's happening with your data, have you done anything about that? This is something that has really impacted our network of affiliates. They pay based on clicks and banners. So I'd like to know whether you've seen anything in terms of transparency, and is there any public initiative requesting an auditing of everything that has been done concerning this kind of fraud? My name is Aristide. I am a lawyer. And my question is the following. You probably all know that some purchased websites present different prices depending on the data they collect from users. So the device being used, where they are accessing from, some existing cookies. With the new law, would it be gone or would it be more transparent? Because for many law people, this is not clear yet. Talked closer to that when he talked about the hotels. Last question. Very interesting topic. I would have questions to everyone, but I'll just have one to Mario. A lot has been said about profiling. And in insurance, through profiling, we can assess individualized risks, and it may weaken this idea of mutuality. In other words, when I have an insurance, there should be some opacity. In other words, risks are shared among people and not individualized. If I individualize risks, what I have noticed in many studies, insurance will be a discrimination rather than being a mutualistic thing. So let's start. Mario and Professor Ricardo, who have some questions to be answered. Well, I'll have my questions answered. First, so GDPR, we can read the right to explanation in two different ways, and I think Professor Abramovai today quoted Luciano Floridian, who is one of the main specialists in data and ethics. He's one of the critics. He says there is no right to explanation. For me, explanation takes two things: understanding the logics. There is the challenge of the black box, as we heard today. The fact that I grant you access, bits and bytes and everything, does not necessarily solve the problem. What has been done, and there is one study by Professor Virgilio, and we heard today by Professor Abramovai, of a control over data, what gets in, what gets out, and infer the logic. The fact that you open the logic is not something that would solve the problem. So you have to know about the information, the sources, and you have to know not only about the information, but what has been the most impacting for decision making. So the fact that you are black or Latin or European, male or female, really trying to identify points for discrepancy. There is an interesting case, and most of you who work with consumer rights have heard of it. An organization had a case and discussed that according to the European directive about non-discrimination. And there was something related to safe activity. To have safe activity, there should be a differentiation based on gender. And the European court said that was not valid. It was not according to the principles of the European Union. And it has created a problem because you could no longer sell products only to women. You wouldn't have products based just on gender. Statistically, anything can be relevant, right? But there are statistics that for car insurance, women tend to have fewer accidents. Some say they are more frequent, but less severe. Men have more severe accidents, but of less importance. So insurance costs more for women, so that there would be no categorization because of gender. So there's a problem of reverse mutualism. So they interpret that and said that it is not that you cannot have a distinction. You should not have that information being used within the scope. So this is the idea, the logic of knowing that not one factor will make a difference. It's not my race, my sexual orientation, or my nationality, but it's rather guaranteeing the information based on a disproportional element. I think that this is something that we can always come up with. If you have simpler things, for example, you can open that for validation, but within an algorithm, I don't think that would be simple. And this is the active thing of giving a possibility when correcting information. You can add things to justify one specific situation. Last year, I didn't pay something. I didn't pay within the range because that day I was on a plane. The plane fell. I could not go to that. I had an accident. There are two perceptions there. Usually talk about the logics of the system, but you update information or you add more information. So two roles of intervention. These are very interesting topics. That's why I'm taking so long. Concerning the mutuality, so you monitor one specific person, and if you base everything on that specific person, this might have a negative impact. And this is why I think that if you can have broader groups with similar profiles, but not independently, we can run the risk of having negative impact if we go step by step. Rather than analyzing the story of the profile, you start monitoring step by step. So health insurance, I'm going to charge more because you walk too long, you have a different exercise. As Ricardo has said, there is a challenge of technology, much faster. There are some car insurances relating on the way you drive. Depending on how well you drive, you pay more or less insurance. Usually they offer the possibility of, I am not an insurance technician, but still, the authorities in France allow you to use a GPS and you monitor utilization and you pay according to your specific profile. For cars, maybe that's not the case, but if you have a life insurance, then you have a greater impact. But I agree with Ricardo saying that the society will have to decide how far we want to go. There are few ethical decisions that we make when we adopt the legislation. We define if you talk about health insurance, we have made some decisions. In Brazil, you cannot refuse to offer coverage. You cannot say because there is an age range or a pre-existing disease. You cannot exclude someone from the service. I cannot, within 2 years, simply hear that they cannot cover me because there is a disease. No. So there is a maximum period of action. I agree that the society will have to make this decision. Now, Ricardo, please. If you can be brief, that would be mostly appreciated. I think that the law protects data, and this is what we need. The purpose is to protect and not create exclusions. So I think we should have a broad understanding. Another thing is important, and post-positivism considered that, is that not all answers will be given by a law. When we exchange our philosophy for Kant and Heidegger, what matters not what the text concerns, but the being interprets and creates. So we have to give better response according to the Constitution. For the second issue, dynamic prices, there is one challenge there, to know to what extent it's being abused or not. But there is one important element, which is transparency. All companies that are going to offer dynamic prices have to tell consumers, I'm going to charge you as much as I can. I'm going to explore your need so that you can pay the highest price. This transparency has to be upfront for all consumers. It's an existing rule of Article 31. You have to make sure that you have transparency of information, and then the society will make a decision. If they think it's acceptable to explore the need of someone else to make a profit, it's a decision of society. If they think there should be a limit, the society may say something. What is not acceptable is something hidden, because then there is a problem of ethics and a legal issue. So this is a very important moment when we're discussing dynamic price range. it's in the law, it's okay, we accept, but we want transparency. Is it going to cost more because you are going to explore my availability to pay more? Fine, but please let me know. And then we go into limitation, always considering price variation. There is no price control. So we need a law that defines limitation. For airlines, it does exist because one of the requirements for concession is to make sure that you offer the best product to consumers. So any practice of dynamic prices of airline companies, I know it's abusive commercial practice. And all other cases, what really values is the amount. So if you agree to pay more and be further explored, fine. This is part of the game. If not, we set limits. We need more discussion. Ethics shouldn't be accessory. It is the main element. There is no democracy if there is no people. If people do not participate, there is no democracy. Because there is not always one single answer, but there are values that we society are going to adopt. So this is my suggestion to that, transparency. Joyce and Veridiana for the closing remarks. Different from my colleagues, I do not come from law. My training is not in law. So my analysis about personal data concerns sociology and the impact that collection and use cause to the Brazilian society. So answering to you, Luisa, I think that yes, it is possible to have transparency. Congratulations on your work. I think transparency will only be achieved once work such as yours are performed, because unless we have that, nobody is questioned, and it's no reason why they'll make it transparent. How can they show the practice, the market practice and regulation of prices based on what they are not expected to do? And I'd like to make an observation concerning the insurance market. Listening to my colleagues in the perspective of law, there is one thing that the law states and another thing that I can observe in my analysis. So there is no profile of exclusion allowed by the insurance market, as Mario has said. But in the perspective that I know, the value is indeed one classification. When I increase NS, regulate for individual plans, because most insurance do not have that. If it's a corporate plan and an affinity plan, which is another modality, we can have better negotiation power. If it's data analysis, I can have predictive analysis of categories and increase the value based on that. The car insurance, there are 2 insurance companies in Brazil monitoring based on apps. Just by downloading the app, you get a 5% discount in your car, and then it means that the company will monitor you, how you drive, how frequently you use your car, where you park. So yes, it is happening. Thank you. Viridiana? Concerning cookie stuffing, there has been no specific study on our side. Based on information that I have, it's more related to distribution of commissions and markers. And it shows that among agents, there are issues of transparency and lack of understanding on how to use it. So it brings, again, the need that all techniques can be used transparently and with information. And based on what we've heard about asymmetry of information, there is a symmetry of information concerning risk analysis that have to be done. But information asymmetry is towards the citizens and people whose data are collected and treated with less and less control. And the legislation comes to place us in the right position, owner of our own data, subjects in a world that is based on data. Even though that hasn't been a question to me, but talking about what Renato asked about the changes that were just made last minute before the legislation and the law was presented for voting. And thanks to everything that we've said, the example of drugstores, the example of online advertising, if it's a behavioral profile, understanding Article 29 working power, if it's a behavioral profile that leads to an identification so that conclusions are drawn relative to this profile with contents or even important decisions in people's life based on the set of information, we cannot talk about data protection. As Ricardo pointed out, data protection is our protection, protecting us, subjects. We cannot have an understanding where having a profile that is not protected by the law. So I cannot accept that. So we will have to go back to the definition of personal data, which is within it. I would like to also urge you to apply pressure so that we can have a full approval of the data privacy law. Finally, we are going to have general rules to help us, applicable not only to the private, but also to the public sector, based on everything we've said so far. So the period of discussions and reflections of the society through which we have all been part is taken now place during the signature of the law. Thank you very much. I'll just be brief and just make two observations. Luisa, thank you for sharing the information. I did not know that there was something concerning the insurance, but we have to set limits and data protection law that we all expect to be approved, because if not, I've been working with that for 15 years, so I will have less work to do. So I hope it can be approved shortly, and here and somewhere else in the world. Transparency, I totally agree, and I think I said that it's a two-way route. And there are mechanisms, at least for transparency, and CDC, as Ricardo pointed out, which is something already in place. There is the possibility of pharmacies of having access to information, but there is no specific authority or an authority center. But today we have the Customer Defense Code and all that. But the person itself, herself or himself, can look for it. So transparency is the key for it all. Two words are essential for the European regulation, and it applies to us as well: transparency and responsibility. You have to work with these two elements in the private and public sector. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I would like to thank you all. Thank Joyce, Mariani, Mario, and Ricardo. It was an extremely enriching and high-quality panel. Thank you very much for sending us your questions so that we had a very pleasant panel. I would like to make my final remarks As we are running very late for lunch, I haven't added anything. It's not something common for a professor of law, especially from the University of São Paulo. So things that really would drive me to say a lot. But I think that it is a panel that has brought us to a reflection. This year, we are celebrating the anniversary of the law of private law for information technology and communication. Being a regulator and a professor and analyzing how many theories turn out to be not practical, actually, I fear the situation because a lot has been lost in telecom. So I wish that within 10 or 15 years, we will not be faced with equally problems in personal data privacy. There is still a discussion whether this law has to be signed by next week or not. But anyway, I fear the future because very ambitious regulations with delayed social structures, and I'm not talking about the telecom sector, but it has led to a long process of judicialization. Not because of everything that we've said here. I am a regulator. I'm not going to be captured, so to speak, by it. And I think that it can be something brought to the sector as a whole. This is not the right reasoning, and it's not correct for the people who are still here advocating for the public cause. And this is something anthropological. In many situations, we cannot give answers, and therefore it leads to a demoralization of the process and a judicialization. In poor countries, it becomes an instrument to share income. And then courts, in turn, offer a counter response, which is limiting the amount of indemnity. And that it should have been solved by politics, regulation, and other things. So it has to be, if people really want that level, and people are not really concerned about it, and the idea is just to give a amount of money to data. Will it be personal? Will it be financial? And we'll be able to talk about that in the near future. From a Kant perspective, where will data be found? Because this is the discussion that will define the model that we are addressing here. So I would like to invite you to join me on this understanding. Which regulation will we have for Brazil in upcoming years? Thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon.